Before we get into the full story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. It helps us bring more unbelievable stories like this one. And don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Grace sat quietly in the small living room, where the scent of salt from the sea mixed with the aroma of freshly brewed tea. The house, though modest, held decades of memories, laughter, tears, and everything in between. She traced her finger along the armrest of the old armchair that once belonged to Peter, her late husband. Peter had been the rock, the fisherman who braved the waters while she held things together at home. It was strange, she thought, how a house so full of life could now feel so empty. The kids, Michael and Elaine, had built lives of their own, far from this quiet coastal town, and while they still visited on occasion, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that they no longer saw her as the vibrant woman she once was. "You've got so much left in you," Peter used to say with a smile. But these days, Grace wasn't so sure. Her independence had always been her pride, yet now, at 82, there was no denying the growing weariness in her bones. But Grace had always been a fighter. She refused to let herself be reduced to the fragile old woman people often assumed she was. Every morning, she would walk along the beach, as if trying to catch pieces of her past in the sea breeze. The routine brought her solace, even if it couldn't fill the void left by Peter's passing or the absence of her children. "You're not done yet," she'd mutter to herself, a defiant reminder that life, even in its twilight years, could still hold surprises. Perhaps it was a stubborn refusal to let go, or maybe it was hope. Hope that something or someone might come along to spark the light within her once again. Grace often thought back to the days when her home was bustling with activity, when Michael and Elaine were just children. The simplicity of those times, filled with small joys, like the smell of freshly baked bread or the sound of Peter's laugh after a long day at sea, felt distant now. She remembered how they would all gather around the dinner table, discussing everything from school to the fisherman's gossip. The house had been alive then, but now it was a silent witness to her solitude. It wasn't that her children didn't care. It was simply that their lives had moved on, while hers seemed to have come to a standstill. Still, she couldn't blame them. Who wouldn't get swept up in the currents of their own lives? One evening, as she sat staring out at the setting sun, Grace couldn't help but wonder if this was how it was supposed to be. Was life, after so many years of hard work and dedication, meant to be lived out in quiet isolation? She had once imagined her old age differently, surrounded by family, perhaps grandchildren running through the house, the sound of their laughter filling the air. But reality was often far from the dreams of youth. Still, she wasn't bitter. If anything, she felt a quiet resignation, coupled with a flicker of hope. After all, Grace had always believed that life had its way of surprising you when you least expected it. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chapter of her story yet to be written. And so, each day, Grace continued her walks, her thoughts swirling like the waves crashing against the shore. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: she wasn't ready to give up. The tide had a way of turning when you least expected it, and Grace, with her quiet determination, was still standing at the edge, waiting to see what the next wave might bring. Grace had always been proud of the lives her children had built. Michael, with his high-powered job in the city, and Elaine, living abroad, seemed to have everything figured out. They were good people, hardworking, and loved her deeply. Yet, the distance between them had grown over the years, not just in miles, but in the ways they connected. Their calls were brief, checking in, making sure she was okay. But they often felt more like formalities than real conversations. "Busy with work," Michael would say, his voice hurried. Elaine was no different, often rushing through their chats with stories of her kids and her career, but rarely asking about Grace's days. She knew they cared, but it was as if they had begun seeing her as more of a task on their to-do lists rather than the woman who had once been their whole world. It wasn't that Grace wanted to be a burden. Far from it. She had spent her whole life taking care of others, and she was determined not to need anyone's help, even now. But as the years passed, she noticed little things starting to slip. The garden, once her pride and joy, had weeds creeping in, and sometimes she struggled to carry the groceries up the steps to the house. She managed, of course. She always managed. Still, there was a growing fear she kept buried deep inside, a fear that her children might start to see her as incapable. And that was the last thing she wanted. So when Michael brought up the idea of moving to a retirement home during his last visit, Grace's heart sank. He hadn't meant to hurt her. She knew that. But hearing her own son suggest that she couldn't handle living on her own anymore struck a chord. She'd smiled politely, told him she'd think about it, but inside, her mind was made up. There was no way she was leaving her home. It wasn't just about pride. It was about identity. This house, this town, this life. It was who she was. To leave it behind felt like surrendering, and Grace wasn't ready to do that. Not yet. She remembered Michael's face as he left, still thinking he had done her a favor by bringing it up, and the thought made her chest tighten with a mix of sadness and anger. Elaine, of course, wasn't there for the conversation. Living abroad with her own family, she didn't visit nearly as often as Michael, but when she did, their time together was always filled with more pleasantries than real talk. Grace loved hearing about her grandchildren's accomplishments and Elaine's career advancements, but there was always a sense that Elaine's life was just too far removed from hers now. "Mom, you should think about slowing down," Elaine had said the last time they spoke. Slowing down. As if she had any other choice. But Grace didn't say what was on her mind. She didn't want to burden them with her frustrations, with the growing sense of loneliness that their absence created. Still, it weighed on her. The disconnect. The sense that her children were living lives so far from her own that she had somehow become an afterthought. And though she would never say it out loud, the thought of growing old without them nearby, without meaningful conversations, without the closeness they once shared, terrified her. She didn't resent them. She understood the demands of life, the pull of careers and families of their own, but understanding didn't make it hurt any less. That night, after Michael's visit, Grace stood by the window, watching the waves crash against the shore, the same way they had for years. The ocean was a constant in her life, but everything else seemed to be shifting. She felt the distance between herself and her children growing with each passing day. They loved her, yes, but love from afar felt hollow sometimes. It wasn't enough to sustain her in the quiet of her house. Grace sighed, knowing that the days ahead would require more from her than she had expected, but she was determined. She would find a way to keep her independence, to remind herself, and her children, that she wasn't done living just yet. One morning, as Grace made her way along the familiar path by the beach, something different caught her eye. There was a man standing near the water's edge, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his coat, staring out at the horizon. He looked out of place, as if he, too, was searching for something in the endless stretch of sea. Grace, curious but reserved, walked closer, not intending to engage. But as she neared him, the man turned, offering a warm, unexpected smile. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" he said, his voice calm, yet filled with a quiet energy. Grace, slightly startled, nodded. "It is," she replied, her voice softer than she intended. They exchanged a few pleasantries, just enough to learn that his name was Jack, and he had recently moved to the town. "Trying to find some peace," he said with a small laugh, "or whatever's left of it." Over the next few weeks, their encounters became more frequent. Grace found herself looking forward to her walks, knowing she might run into Jack along the way. There was something about him. Maybe it was the way he seemed so comfortable in his own solitude, or the way he never pried into her life, even as their conversations grew longer. He spoke of his past, the adventures he had in his youth, the quiet joy he found in simple things like reading a good book or tending to his small garden. Grace, for the first time in what felt like years, found herself smiling more, laughing even. Jack had a way of making the heaviness she'd been carrying seem lighter. "You should try gardening," he suggested one morning, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "It's good for the soul." Grace had chuckled, brushing off the idea. But there was something about the way he said it that made her think, maybe, just maybe, she could give it a try. As the days passed, Grace found herself opening up to Jack in ways she hadn't with anyone in years. He had a way of listening, really listening, that made her feel seen, as if her thoughts and feelings mattered again. It was a strange feeling, this newfound connection, and yet it felt so natural, so easy. Jack, too, seemed to be getting something out of their friendship. He began to visit her at home, helping with small tasks she struggled with, like fixing the squeaky front door or carrying in the heavier groceries. Grace, at first hesitant, soon realized that accepting his help didn't make her weak. In fact, it made her feel stronger, knowing she wasn't doing it all alone anymore. One afternoon, as they sat in Grace's garden, Jack handed her something small and sleek, a tablet. "What am I supposed to do with this?" she asked, half joking, half serious. "Stay connected," Jack replied, his tone light but meaningful. "There's a whole world out there, Grace. You don't have to be so alone." At first, she resisted. Technology had never been her thing, and the idea of learning how to use this new device seemed overwhelming. But Jack, patient as ever, showed her how to navigate it, step by step. Soon, Grace found herself connecting with people she hadn't spoken to in years, joining online groups for older adults, and even learning new things from the comfort of her own home. It was liberating in a way she hadn't expected, and she had Jack to thank for it. Their friendship blossomed in ways Grace hadn't anticipated. Jack brought something back into her life that she thought was long gone, a sense of purpose, of adventure, of curiosity. He reminded her that even at 82, there was still so much to explore, so much to feel. "You know," he said one day as they watched the sun set over the water, "we're not done yet, Grace. There's still time for a few more surprises." Grace smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in years. Maybe he was right. Maybe life, with all its ups and downs, still had a few more chapters left for her to live. One evening, as the wind howled outside and the rain beat softly against the windows, Grace and Jack sat together, sipping tea by the fire. It was a peaceful moment, yet there was a sense of something unspoken lingering between them. Jack stared into his cup for a long while before he finally spoke. "There's something I've never told you," he began, his voice quieter than usual. Grace looked at him, sensing the weight of what was about to be shared. "Back in my younger days, I was part of something bigger. I wasn't just Jack, the quiet old man you see now. I was an activist. We fought for change, for justice." His words hung in the air, heavy with memories of a life she had never imagined him living. Grace listened intently, leaning forward as Jack recounted stories of protests, of nights spent hiding from authorities, of friends who never made it out. "I lost people," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "Good people. And sometimes I wonder, did we really make a difference?" There was a rawness in his confession that Grace hadn't seen in him before. He wasn't just the man who had brought laughter and light back into her life. He was someone who had carried the burden of history on his shoulders. Grace could see the regret in his eyes, the lingering question of whether he had done enough, and it stirred something deep within her. As Jack spoke, Grace felt a shift within herself. She began to think about her own life, the choices she had made, the opportunities she had let slip through her fingers. For so long, she had played it safe, always choosing the path of least resistance. She had been a good wife, a good mother, but there were moments when she had yearned for something more. "I had dreams too, you know," she said, surprising herself with the sudden outburst. Jack looked at her, his expression soft but curious. "What kind of dreams?" he asked, his voice gentle, coaxing her to open up. Grace hesitated for a moment, but then the words poured out. I wanted to travel, see the world, but there was always something. Kids, Peter's work, responsibilities. So I stayed. The rain outside seemed to intensify, as if mirroring the storm of emotions Grace felt inside. It's funny, isn't it? She continued, her voice tinged with both sadness and a hint of laughter. You think you have all the time in the world, and then one day you wake up and realize it's gone. Jack nodded, understanding the weight of her words in a way only someone with a similar history could. He didn't offer platitudes or hollow reassurances. Instead, he simply said, It's not too late, you know. Grace looked at him, her heart aching with the possibility he was offering. Could it really be true? At 82, could she still live out the dreams she had buried so long ago? They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling softly in the background, both lost in their thoughts. Grace felt the pull of her past, the decisions she had made, the life she had lived, and yet there was a stirring within her, a whisper that maybe, just maybe, the story wasn't over yet. Jack had opened a door she hadn't even realized was still there, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of excitement. What if we could still do it? Grace asked, almost to herself. Jack smiled, his eyes bright with mischief and hope. Well, what's stopping us? And just like that, a seed was planted. It wasn't just about regrets anymore, it was about possibilities. The future, however uncertain, stretched out before them like the vast ocean outside, full of waves yet to be explored. Grace felt something she hadn't felt in years, a sense of anticipation, of adventure. And though she didn't know where this newfound energy would take her, she knew one thing for certain. With Jack by her side, there was no telling how far they could go. The day Grace proposed the trip, Jack nearly choked on his coffee. Paris? He repeated, as if he hadn't heard her correctly the first time. Grace, with a grin that betrayed both excitement and determination, nodded. Yes, Paris. I've always dreamed of seeing the Eiffel Tower. You said it yourself, Jack. What's stopping us? Jack, still recovering from the shock, leaned back in his chair and shook his head, laughing softly. Well, I thought you might suggest something a little closer, like the next town over. But Paris? That's a bit ambitious, don't you think? Grace's eyes sparkled with a fire Jack hadn't seen before. Maybe, she admitted, but why not aim high? The idea of the trip took root quickly after that. Every day, Grace and Jack would sit together, poring over maps and guidebooks, researching flights and accommodations. Grace was like a woman reborn, her energy contagious, her enthusiasm boundless. I can't believe we're really doing this, she said one afternoon, her voice filled with disbelief and excitement. Jack, who had initially been hesitant, found himself just as swept up in the adventure. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose, a reason to get out of bed every morning. Grace had that effect on him. She made the impossible seem not only possible, but inevitable. Of course, not everyone shared their excitement. When Grace called Michael and Elaine to tell them about the trip, their reactions were less than enthusiastic. Mom, are you serious? Michael's voice was full of disbelief. At your age? Paris is a long way from here, and what if something happens? It's irresponsible. Grace, who had anticipated some resistance, took a deep breath. I know it's a big trip, but I'm not dead yet, Michael. I'm healthy, I'm capable, and I want to do this. Elaine, though more gentle, shared similar concerns. Mom, we just worry about you. Maybe you could start with something smaller. A weekend getaway, perhaps? But Grace, for the first time in many years, put her foot down. I've spent my whole life playing it safe. This time, I'm doing something for me. The conversations with her children left Grace feeling both deflated and more determined than ever. She loved them, of course, but their doubts only fueled her desire to prove that she was still capable of living life on her own terms. They think I've lost my mind, she confided in Jack later that evening. Jack, with his usual humor, chuckled. Well, if that's true, then I've lost mine too. But I say we're just finding it again. There was something liberating about defying expectations, about choosing adventure over caution, and Grace was reveling in the thrill of it. As the departure date grew closer, Grace felt a mix of excitement and nerves. Traveling to another country at her age was no small feat, but with Jack by her side, she felt braver than she had in years. We're really doing this, aren't we? She asked him one evening, as they finalized the last of their travel plans. Jack smiled, his eyes twinkling. Oh, we're doing it, all right. And who knows what we'll discover along the way. Grace felt a flutter of anticipation in her chest. This wasn't just about seeing Paris. It was about reclaiming a piece of herself she thought was long lost. And so, with suitcases packed and passports in hand, Grace and Jack stood at the airport, ready to embark on the journey of a lifetime. As the plane took off, Grace looked out the window, watching as the world below became smaller and smaller. She felt a rush of emotions, fear, excitement, and a deep sense of freedom. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't just existing. She was living. The moment Grace stepped off the plane in Paris, she felt a rush of exhilaration. The cool air, the foreign sounds, the sight of the city she had only seen in books, it all felt surreal. Jack, standing beside her, shared a similar expression of wonder, though his steps were slower, more cautious. We made it, he whispered, as if saying it out loud might break the spell. Grace nodded, her heart pounding with a mix of excitement and disbelief. Paris! She was really here. She gripped the handle of her suitcase a little tighter, feeling the weight of not just her belongings, but the significance of this moment. It wasn't just about the trip. It was about the freedom, the possibility that life, even at 82, could still surprise her. Their days in Paris were a whirlwind of discovery. The city, with its bustling streets and iconic landmarks, was both overwhelming and exhilarating. Grace and Jack navigated the cobblestone streets, sometimes with the help of a map, other times simply letting themselves get lost in the adventure. You ever think we'd be doing this? Jack asked one afternoon, as they stood at the base of the Eiffel Tower, craning their necks to take in its full height. Grace, her eyes wide with awe, shook her head. Never, she admitted, but I'm glad we are. The climb to the top was out of the question, but just standing there, in the shadow of the tower, felt like a victory. The trip wasn't without its challenges, of course. Traveling at their age came with a set of obstacles that younger tourists took for granted. Long lines, unfamiliar languages, and the physical toll of walking through the city left Grace and Jack exhausted at times. But for every moment of fatigue, there was an equally thrilling moment of discovery. Grace had always been resilient, and this trip was proving just how much strength she still had left. I never thought I'd see the world like this, she confided in Jack one evening, as they sat at a small cafe, sipping coffee and watching the world go by. I always thought my chance had passed. Jack smiled, his hand resting on hers. The world isn't done with you yet, Grace. It wasn't just Paris that was changing them. It was the journey itself. The act of stepping out of their comfort zones, of facing their fears and embracing the unknown, had ignited something in both Grace and Jack. They weren't just tourists. They were explorers, rediscovering the world and themselves in the process. Every day brought new sights, new sounds, new experiences that reminded them of the beauty and unpredictability of life. Grace found herself reflecting on the past less and less, her focus shifting instead to the present moment. The weight of old regrets and missed opportunities began to lift, replaced by a sense of peace and fulfillment. By the time they reached the end of their trip, Grace felt as though she had been transformed. Paris, with all its magic, had given her something far more valuable than memories. It had given her a new perspective. She realized that life wasn't about counting the years, but about making the years count. "I feel younger," she joked to Jack as they prepared to board the plane back home. Jack laughed, though there was a seriousness in his eyes. "That's because you are younger," he said softly. "You've got the spirit of someone who's just starting out." Grace smiled at that. In a way, he was right. This journey had been more than just a trip. It had been a rebirth. As the plane soared through the clouds, Grace leaned her head against the window, watching the sky stretch out endlessly before her. She felt a deep sense of contentment, knowing that she had not just lived, but had truly embraced life. There was still more to see, more to experience, more to discover. And with Jack by her side, she knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with endless possibilities. When Grace and Jack returned home, everything felt different. The small coastal town, which once seemed too quiet, now felt like a sanctuary, a place of peace rather than isolation. Grace, stepping back into her modest home, took a deep breath, letting the familiar scent of salt air wash over her. It was as though she had left behind the weight of the past in Paris. But the real surprise came when her children, Michael and Elaine, called to check in on her. Their voices, once rushed and distracted, now carried something new: curiosity. "So, how was it?" Michael asked, his tone lighter than usual. Grace smiled to herself, knowing this conversation was different. For the first time in years, they wanted to hear about her life, not just report on their own. Michael and Elaine couldn't believe what they heard. Paris? At 82? They asked question after question, amazed at the stories Grace shared about the trip, the sights she'd seen, the people she'd met. Elaine even mentioned how her own kids were inspired by their grandmother's adventure. "You're a legend now, Mom," she joked. Grace laughed, feeling a warmth she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just that her children were listening, it was that they were seeing her in a new light. Not as someone to worry about or take care of, but as someone who still had a lot to give, a lot to teach. Grace realized that the trip hadn't just transformed her, it had changed the way her children saw her. Over the next few weeks, Grace noticed a shift in her relationship with Michael and Elaine. They called more often, not out of obligation, but out of genuine interest. Conversations grew longer, more meaningful. Michael, who had once suggested she move into a care facility, now asked if he could come visit more often. "I miss home," he admitted, and Grace knew he wasn't just talking about the town. He missed her. Elaine, too, began making plans to visit with her family, wanting to spend more time with the woman who had shown them all that life didn't end at retirement. Grace felt a new sense of connection with her children, a bond that had been strengthened, not by proximity, but by the shared understanding that she was still growing, still living, still capable of surprises. But it wasn't just her children who were affected by the trip. Grace found herself becoming something of an inspiration within the community. Neighbors, who once saw her as just another elderly woman in the town, now stopped by to hear about her adventures. Some even asked for advice. "How did you find the courage to do it?" they would ask, and Grace would smile, thinking back to that first conversation with Jack on the beach. "It wasn't about courage," she would say. "It was about realizing that there's still time to live the life you want." Jack, of course, stood by her side, his own quiet strength an anchor for them both. Together, they became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that age is just a number. As the weeks turned into months, Grace and Jack settled back into their routines, but something had shifted within both of them. The future no longer felt like a slow descent into obscurity. It felt open, full of possibility. They made plans, small trips, new activities, even more time spent together. The world, once vast and daunting, now seemed smaller, more accessible. Grace often found herself wondering what other adventures might be waiting around the corner. "We've still got time," she would say to Jack, and he would nod, smiling in agreement. They both knew that the trip to Paris had been just the beginning. There were more moments to seize, more life to live. Grace's legacy, she realized, wouldn't be about the things she had done in her younger years. It wouldn't be about the sacrifices or the struggles. It would be about the way she had chosen to live, even when the world told her it was too late. And in that choice, she had found not just a new beginning for herself, but a lasting gift for her family. A reminder that life is always waiting to be embraced, no matter how many years have passed. As Grace sat on her porch, watching the sunset dip below the horizon, she reflected on how far she had come. The journey to Paris had been more than just a vacation. It had been a turning point, a reminder that life, even in its later stages, still held so much potential. She smiled to herself, thinking of all the small moments that had led her to this place. The quiet mornings, the difficult conversations with her children, the unexpected friendship with Jack. Life, she realized, was never meant to be a straight line. It was filled with twists, turns, and moments that could change everything if you were brave enough to embrace them. There was something liberating about knowing that she didn't have to follow a set path. Grace had spent most of her life thinking that her best years were behind her, that the chapters of excitement and adventure were long closed. But as she and Jack planned their next small trip together, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, a deep, undeniable sense of possibility. "We're not done yet," Jack often reminded her, and she knew he was right. The journey, it seemed, was just beginning. For those who might be tempted to believe that age defines the limits of what you can do, Grace's story offers a different perspective. It's not about how many years you've lived, but about how much life you've put into those years. Grace's late-in-life adventure didn't come from some grand plan. It came from a single choice: to say yes to the unknown. It came from the belief that no matter where you are in life, there's always more to discover. And that's the secret, isn't it? The willingness to keep moving forward, to keep exploring, to keep dreaming. The message is clear. It's never too late to live fully. Whether it's a trip across the world or simply trying something new, there's always room to grow, to learn, to experience. Grace had spent years thinking her life was winding down, but in reality, she had just been waiting for the next chapter to begin. And now, as she and Jack continued to walk hand in hand through whatever life had in store for them, she knew that the greatest adventures often come when you least expect them. So, the story doesn't end here. It keeps going, just like Grace, just like Jack, just like life itself. The journey is continuous, filled with surprises at every turn. And if there's one thing Grace hopes others take from her story, it's this: no matter where you are, no matter how old you are, it's never too late to start again. The next adventure is always just around the corner, waiting for you to say yes. Moral of the story: life has a way of surprising us, doesn't it? Grace's story isn't just about a will or an inheritance. It's a wake-up call. It reminds us that the people we often take for granted may be the ones who end up showing us the greatest lessons. Grace made a bold move to claim her life, her happiness, and, ultimately, her legacy. So, here's the real question: who in your life have you been overlooking? Are you investing your time in the people who truly matter? Think about it. Are there relationships in your life that need more attention? Maybe it's time to reconnect, before it's too late. What would you have done if you were in Grace's shoes? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And while you're at it, be sure to click on the next video to hear more incredible stories like this. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on the next life-changing lesson.